Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV, Kate and Julian. Kate, in this week's magazine, you look at Putin's billions and whether the sanctions by the West and other countries are really working. Can you give us a run through to begin with of what has been put on the table so far?
So there have been a vast array of sanctions coming from the West targeted at Russia, from freezing the accounts of notorious oligarchs to freezing Russian banks and companies out of the financial system. The goal has essentially been to push Russia and its economy to the outer limits of the global economy and to keep them out of as much as possible Putin's central bank assets, of which they're about $600 billion worth. About a third of those have managed to be frozen by the international community because they're foreign assets. So quite a lot has been done. But what this article really looks at is arguably one of the most important sanctions that was not brought in early and in many places still hasn't been brought in. And that would be on Russia's energy. And without bringing in serious sanctions on Russian energy, what we've seen as this war has caused energy prices to spike, the cost of oil, the cost of gas all going up, is that Putin has actually been raking it in. At the moment, he's bringing in about $800 million a day, and about a fourth of that is coming from Germany alone. And so when you put that into perspective, we can talk about economic sanctions all we want, but the West is still very much funding Putin's war chest. It's difficult for him to spend a lot of that money, and I think that's one area where you can argue that perhaps the sanctions are working, but the point of this article is that it really is a mixed picture. And if the goal was to completely cripple Russia's economy and to deprive Putin of these of his funds for his war chest, arguably we have not been all that successful.
Julian, do you think the sanctions could be backfiring?
Well, first of all, I think I agree with almost everything that Kate has just said. I would say, though, that economic sanctions, I think, always going to play sort of second fiddle to the more important issue, which is making sure that Russia loses the war in Ukraine itself. And, so far the evidence is that militarily it's been a disaster for Russia. And I think that's probably the single most important thing at the moment. As far as the economic sanctions are concerned, I agree that they've probably backfired in the short term, in the sense that they've actually sort of raised the price of the key commodities that Russia is selling, and they've still been able to find good markets outside Europe and the rest of the West. But I think in the longer term, they will be far more effective. And I think that is the bigger issue for Russia. Yes, they've been able to sell some more energy and other commodities at higher prices now, but it's pretty clear that the long-term tide is moving against them. Europe will slowly diversify away from Russian oil and gas, and that's a big hit to the economy. On top of that, you've got all the, if you like, the softer stuff as well. So the brain drain from Russia, the cultural isolation, all those sorts of things. They may not have much immediate impact on the headline economic numbers, but they're undoubtedly painful. And the fact that so many people who have supported Putin more or less explicitly over the last few years, the oligarchs, have been hit hard as well. I think there'll be some sort of price to pay for that in the future. But in the meantime, I think we have to be realistic and ask what the alternatives were. I mean, clearly no sanctions against Russia would not have been acceptable. At the other extreme, a complete ban on buying Russian oil and gas would have triggered an immediate recession in the West. So I think we had to be realistic. And personally, I think we probably got the balance about right.
Kate, how realistic is it for Germany to reduce its energy supply when it comes to Russia? Obviously, there's pressure from other leaders for the Germans to do this, but it is easier said than done.
Oh, it's much easier said than done. But I think that's one of the points of the piece, which is that the West wants to pat itself on the back and say, look at this amazing work we're doing. We've taken every step we can to be an ally of Ukraine. And the truth is we haven't taken every step we can, because for all the reasons that Julian's just pointed out, it is near impossible for Germany to overnight decide that it's no longer going to import Russian gas, not least because other countries that are more energy independent, like the US, have not been especially helpful. There's been murmurs that the US might help supply energy to countries like Germany, but we haven't really seen that come to fruition. So, unless you want to essentially damn your society to the lights going out and a recession overnight, it's not possible. But, that phrase just keeps coming to my mind. This is the one thing we didn't want to have happen. And the fact that Putin is expected to bring in more income this year in 2022 when he launched his full-scale invasion than he did last year was clearly not the point of these sanctions. And I think we need a more honest conversation around it. I completely agree with Julian that in the medium to long term, this is going to be extremely painful for Russia. And actually, in the short term, their economy is expected to contract by 10% this year, 4% next year. Whilst the growth figures and the predictions for the West don't look great, they're nothing as bad as that. And Putin is starting to take some very dangerous decisions, and he's playing some very dangerous games by threatening to cut off food exports from Ukraine's port in Odessa, threatening, starting to play with how much gas he's actually importing to Europe, suggesting, look, I can turn off the taps if I want to. The result, if he gets very serious about either of those things, is that people will die from the cold and from starvation. These are really serious games, and he's playing them because of the sanctions. He wants to see them disappear. They are hurting Russia. There's no doubt about that. But he is, in my opinion, in the short term, a stronger position when it comes to European energy in particular. We have found ourselves in a position, in part because of these sanctions, in which Europe is more dependent on Russian gas than Russia is for European cash and that income, because he's had such a windfall of profits in the first half of this year.
Julian, what options are there really for these countries like Germany and the West when it comes to things they could do which would perhaps make these sanctions more effective, but also not, backfiring so much that there's suddenly this big domestic backlash, which you touched on?
Well, actually, one thing to say first is that even if Russia is in some sense winning the sanctions war in the short term, it's very much a hollow victory. If we take the Russian ruble, for example, the currency, that has strengthened to something like a 7-year high against the US dollar, which is quite remarkable. But that's been at the cost of a combination of significant capital controls in Russia itself, and also a collapse in domestic demand. So yes, Russia's still getting lots of money coming in from selling commodities to the West and also to countries like China and India. But at the same time, it's not able to import much from the West, things that it wants, everything from military goods to consumer goods and so on and so on. So that has propped up the balance of payments, which at face value looks extremely healthy. But underlying that, there are deep structural problems in the Russian economy that aren't going to go away anytime soon. And I think that's probably the way that countries like Germany should be looking at this. I mean, ideally, we in the UK or others in the US might like Germany to cut off imports of energy from Russia straight away. But I simply don't think that's realistic. There are lots of countries, Germany is one, Italy is another, who rely on Russia for maybe sort of 40% of their energy, particularly things like natural gas. And you simply cannot find alternative sources of energy that quickly, even with the best will in the world. So I think we have to accept that some countries like Germany and Italy are always going to be behind the pack in terms of reducing their dependency on Russian energy. But importantly, they are signalling their willingness to do so over the medium to longer term. And that is having a big impact. If you look at, for example, Russian equity market, that's still pretty depressed because they're taking a longer term view of the viability of the Russian economy and the energy model in particular. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Germany and Italy and the others need to do more now, but they're absolutely right that they should be signalling their intention to reduce their dependency on Russian energy over time. And I think that's where most of the damage will come.
And Kate, if we look at the illustration of this week's Spectator, ultimately it's Putin surrounded by all this gold. But even if he is, raking it in more than he would be doing without the sanctions when it comes to some of that revenue, he is limited, as Julian mentioned, on what he can actually spend it on. And for example, with things such as the war and getting the right military equipment, it is going to be quite tricky for him to use that money in a way which gets him exactly what he needs, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that's the flip side of this, where you can say that sanctions are having their effects. It is going to be increasingly difficult for Putin to import the military equipment he needs. He's already finding it very hard to get high-tech artillery back into Russia. And to Julian's original point about, what we care about most, Ukraine actually winning this war, it's estimated by UK figures that Russia has already lost a third of its ground force that it sent into Ukraine since it began this war, and that includes 1,000 military vehicles, it includes 100 planes. That's going to be very hard for him to get back into his military. As well, he's been known for years to be working with Russian businessmen to smuggle in microchips that are necessary for military operations, but patrols are increasing. It's getting harder to circumvent, U.S. exports and all the rest of it. So, this is an area where in the medium term, he is definitely going to be feeling that pain. But because he does have access to so much cash, and he's using a lot of that to stimulate artificially the Russian economy, what it can buy him is time. And that is a very real concern, especially as, I understand Julian's point about, we need to be accepting that Germany can't wean itself off Russian gas overnight, but I'm slightly less generous to Chancellor Scholz and the government in Germany right now, because there's been a lot of talk of sending Ukraine weapons and more military supplies, and the Ukrainians are saying, we haven't seen this yet. You certainly get a sense from Germany that they would prefer for this to end sooner rather than later, and you don't always get the sense that they feel very strongly how that has to end, because this is causing so much domestic pain. So as long as Putin has that time and he's able to artificially stimulate his own economy, I think that's really bad news for Ukraine winning this war.
And Julian, in terms of time frame, Kate's touching on obviously the pressure, how the current situation could give Putin time. For these sanctions to be really successful, do you think they have to stay in place for a long time to come?
Well, yes, I do. I think the obvious thing to do is to keep them in place as long as Putin is in power. I think it's very hard to see the West re-engaging with Russia as long as Putin is in power, and presumably as long as Putin is in power, Russia will hold on to whatever parts of Ukraine it's already taken. So I think that we have to be in this for the long haul. As Kate said, this is very difficult to do. I think it's probably easier for us to do in the UK and possibly also in the US than it is for some European countries. But I agree with Kate. There's some worrying signs of backsliding. Kate picked on Germany. I'm going to pick on France, where President Macron seems to take the view that we shouldn't do much to upset Putin. I hate to throw around words like appeasement, but it does feel like that some countries are too concerned about the potential blowback on their own economies to take on somebody who is clearly a murderous tyrant who's doing lots of harm to his neighbours, but also even to his own country. So I think politically it's going to be very difficult for all countries to stay the course against Russia and continue with the sanctions. But frankly, I think we have to until there's a regime change in Russia itself.
And Kate, just finally, touching on those points, we have a situation where there's clearly concern among some governments that there is backsliding by other European leaders. As we just had Macron's idea that Putin should not be humiliated and so forth. So is this going to be a case when it comes to sanctions of who blinks first?
Yeah, I think so. We have this dynamic where we have a shrinking Russian economy and, as Julian said, a murderous tyrant who's sitting on cash and time, but is struggling to spend that cash and at some point may start to run out of time. But you also have Western governments that are looking at very stagnant economic growth, dealing with a cost of living crisis across the West, in which people are getting very frustrated and very angry. We have an inflation crisis on our hands too. And there is a question as to who can sustain this longer. And you do hear worrying murmurs from Europe that, perhaps we're going to have to come to some faster solution and what that actually means for Ukraine and for the sovereignty of Ukraine and for the safety of Ukrainian people doesn't always feel like it's at the forefront of that discussion. So, we always have to be realistic when we consider this and, realistic in what kinds of negotiations might happen, realistic in timeframes. But if the West blinks first and blinks quickly and rapidly, you could certainly find yourself in a situation where Putin isn't just gaming the economic sanctions, he actually also manages to game the military situation between Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Julian.